Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Bullying Prevention, Everyone Plays a Role. My name is Angela Sullivan, CDC Program Coordinator, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon's webinar. This webinar is being provided as part of the Tourette Health and Education Program, a program of the Tourette Association of America in partnership with the CDC. During this afternoon's webinar, we would be very happy to hear from you and include your voice in the conversation. You may ask questions or share comments using the question panel on the right-hand side of your GoToWebinar player at any time. We will collect your questions and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. I would like to mention that the funding for this webinar was made possible by our cooperative agreement with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views expressed by speakers and moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker this evening, Julie Hertzog. Julie is the director of PACER's National Bullying Prevention Center, a nationally recognized leader on bullying prevention. She has helped create the center, and since she helped create the center in 2006, she has led in the development of its resources, including creating content for its innovative websites designed to engage, educate, and inspire students. In addition to developing classroom toolkits, curricula, and other innovative resources, she has also helped create initiatives such as PACER's National Bullying Prevention Month, Unity Day, and Run, Walk, Roll Against Bullying, which are now nationally recognized events each October. Julie holds a master's degree in counseling psychology and has been a staff at PACER Center since 2000. She is married with 3 children, Laura, David, and Grace. David, who is born with Down syndrome, has been the inspiration for much of Julie's work, as students with disabilities are 2 to 3 times more likely than their peers to be bullied. Without further ado, Julie, please go ahead with your presentation.
Great, thank you, Angela. And I think that my screen is showing.
Yes, I can see it.
Oh, okay. All right, and I just double click, so if it's not, just let me know. But I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Angela, for the introduction, and so glad to be here with everyone. And it's always a little interesting to do a webinar when I'm looking at my computer screen talking out to the world, and so that's always an interesting piece to do. And I wanted to start with a slide with my photo on it, so you can get a sense of who is out in cyberspace talking with you. And it's been a pleasure working with TAA on a number of different bullying prevention initiatives through the years. And so thrilled to be here. And as we only have 60 minutes today, and bullying prevention is a significant topic, what my goal is with today's webinar is to just really touch on some basic points, but to cover a broad range of things. So there's a little bit in here for the individuals who are new to the topic, all the way up to some points that are going to be more deeper and more complex. And so a little bit of something for everyone. And I want to just start with a little bit of information about our organization. And as Angela said, we're PACER Center, and we're geographically located in Minneapolis, currently the snow belt of the Midwest, and we're expecting another 12 inches tomorrow, by the way. And we are an advocacy organization, and we were founded in the late 1970s on the philosophy of parents helping parents of children with disabilities. And our connection to bullying was an easy connection in that students with disabilities are bullied at a much higher rate. And so in 2006, we formed a program under PACER's National Bullying Prevention Center, under PACER called we called it the National Bullying Prevention Center. And even though we're founded on students with disabilities, our bullying prevention efforts are really for all kids. And in fact, we go much deeper than that, our resources are not only for the students, but they're also for parents and for educators as well, because we want to be sharing a common language and common goals with all populations, because we really feel that's what it takes. That's a huge part of everybody being on the same page about how to address this issue. And so going to just lead you into the 3 core resources that we have. Our organization has about 70 staff members, and there's only 3 of us who are dedicated to the project. And so our main touch point is our websites. And what we try to do through those websites is to create platforms that are robust enough so that individuals go on them and they have meaning as you going on there as an individual, but that also schools can use them, and that there's the ability to take action at the local level. And I'll get involved, I'll go into more detail about that. But the core one is pacer.org/bullying. And then we also have 2 audience-specific sites. One is for middle and high school students. That's our Teens Against Bullying site. And the third one is for elementary school, pacerkidsagainstbullying.org. And you'll hear me refer to these websites throughout the presentation. And just as far as a setup for what we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to break the agenda down into 4 categories. And the first will be that overview, that kind of bullying 101, I call it, which is the dynamics of bullying. The second category will be promising practices. So that's what's been helpful for students who are being bullied, students who do bully, students who witness it, and also for the parents and educators who love them and want to look out for them. And so we'll be talking about promising practices in that regard. The third will be a little bit more specificity as far as just students with disabilities. And the fourth will be some offering of resources. So we're going to go into that first category, the dynamics of bullying. And again, we're even going to break this one down a little bit into what bullying is, who's involved, how and where it happens, and what is the impact and why is it important. So our first slide here, what is bullying? And I think this is a really important piece, so I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on it, in that there are certain hallmarks of bullying, and I want to just start by mentioning that currently every 50 of our states has legislation about bullying. And also the interesting piece is that almost every state defines bullying a little bit differently. So what we're trying to look at here is just those hallmarks that are included in most definitions. And that first bullet is the person is being hurt, harmed, humiliated with words or behavior. And I think the important thing to take away there is that bullying can be physical, that pushing, that shoving on the playground, but it can also be emotional. And this next one, the next bullet, the behavior is repeated, though it can be a single incident. I think there's a controversy in definitions out there as far as, in most schools will say that bullying should be repeated. And I think the very essence of bullying is that there is this repetition, that it happens over and over again. And that's where the kids, that's the kids that we're really most concerned about, is when the bullying does continue and they can't stop it. And that third bullet is it is being done intentionally. So again, it's not an accidental push or shove. It's done with purpose. The fourth one is the person being hurt has a hard time defending themselves. And again, that's a dynamic, and it's like oftentimes there's bad behavior toward kids, but they're able to stop it on their own. And that's still considered bullying, but it becomes more complicated when the student is not able to stop it on their own. And the fifth bullet there is something called, in most definitions, they'll refer to it as an imbalance of power, which sounds very lofty. So I just want to explain power. And power can be everything from the student being older, so an older student bullying a younger student, someone who just is physically bigger or stronger because that's more intimidating, that sheer size. But it also can be more about social status. And so often we hear from kids that the individuals who are bullying them are in the quote unquote the cool group. And the other dynamic there is it can also be groups of kids ganging up on a single individual, because again, it becomes much harder to be able to defend yourself when there's a group of people against you versus one individual. Also, just in definitions, there's what we call the direct versus indirect. And that direct piece can be those things that are very overt and that you can see them. You know, there's fighting, there's the pushing, there's the name calling. So there's things that we can definitely witness and we can see it happen. But there's also these things that happen definitely out of sight of adults, definitely, but sometimes even you know, the kids themselves aren't seeing it. It can be that very covert thing, and it's the gossip. It's the leaving somebody out on purpose. It's those things that we just can't necessarily see. And some additional factors that can also be included in definitions are oftentimes there'll be a differentiation between bullying and harassment. And I'm going to go into that further in a presentation, so we'll talk about that more. There's also the enumeration of protected classes, which falls under harassment. So if the bullying is based on, for example, disability, there's additional protections, which we'll talk about later. And a lot of definitions also used to focus just on the school themselves, you know, the school itself. And if it happened outside of school, schools were saying it's not the responsibility. But now a lot of the statements look at the use of technology because so often kids have cell phones right in their hands all during school. And so it's an important piece. Also, definitions include how the behavior impacts the educational performance, and again, some definitions even go into further detail to say it could be at a bus stop or on a bus, and so they add some additional layers, or maybe it's after school events, and so those are some important pieces with our definitions. Also, I think it's important, especially when we're talking about school-age students, and again, I would emphasize that this presentation is primarily based on K through 12 students, and we talk a lot about what the difference is between conflict and bullying, because we say that conflict it's a natural part of our human existence, that we're not always going to agree with people. But bullying is different in conflict in that conflict is a disagreement or an argument in which both sides express their views. And if one of the parties recognize that somebody's being hurt by it, they usually monitor their behavior. You know, they read those cues, they modify their behavior when they realize they're hurting someone. Where with bullying, oftentimes when kids realize that they're hurting someone, it almost gives them that energized feeling of saying, "Cool, I have more power. Let's see what I can do to this child." And conflict is about, you know, things are equal between all parties usually, and they usually want the issue to be resolved. They don't want the conflict to continue going on. They want to make things better. They want the relationship to continue. But in bullying, it's really about the inequality of the relationship, and bullying is about control. And so I think that's an important piece just for kids to know too, because with conflict, we can really teach kids how to, if it's true conflict, we can teach kids some problem solving skills with that. But with bullying, we want to recognize that we need to be stepping in and helping the child who's being targeted by the bullying, because they're not going to be able to resolve conflict. They're not going to be able to resolve what the situation without some help. Our next slide then is, how does bullying happen? What does it look like? And again, there's some just dialogue about how these categories look, but I want to break it down into basically 4 categories. And the first just being the verbal. It's using words to tease or harass. And it's definitely the most common type of bullying because it's the easiest to inflict on kids. It's quick, it's direct. It includes teasing, name calling, making threats, intimidation, demeaning jokes about someone's differences, spreading rumors, gossip, slander. And so this is one, again, is the most common. And I would say the research shows it peaks in middle school, and it really does begin to decrease in high school as kids become more socially conscious and learn to accept differences. The second one up there is emotional with social in brackets. And again, some of this overlaps with verbal, but it's the manipulation, the gossip, the exclusion. But the distinction is it's often very, very calculated, and it's sophisticated in that kids may not always be able to define it as bullying because they might not recognize it because it's not physical and they don't understand why it's happening to them. And sometimes this is the one I think kids think that they deserve it. Sometimes it's a rumor about them or something personal about them. And I would say it's also the emotional bullying is generally the most difficult for the casual observer to detect because they usually don't have the knowledge of the social nuances or the social structures that are surrounding the behavior. The third one is pretty self-explanatory. It's the most easy to recognize. It's just that kicking, hitting, pushing, stealing property, forced or unwelcome contact, but there's a definite intent to harm with that too. And I would say the next one, sexual, is oftentimes not mentioned within the bullying realm, and sometimes it's probably the most difficult type for kids and parents to discuss. And it's about what those acceptable boundaries and appropriate behaviors are in our social relationships. It can include sexually charged comments, inappropriate or lewd glances, the inappropriate physical contact, and even sexual assaults. And so I think it's important that we are talking about this and providing our students with just like those important social rules and norms for dating and how they can act respectfully toward their peers and also recognize when somebody is not respecting them. And the fifth one, I put in there a bullet with a little caveat in that we talk a lot about cyberbullying as a type of bullying, but really to me it's more about we're using a modality, a different modality to hurt or harm. But really, cyber can fall into that kind of verbal category as well as the emotional and sexual, how it's used. And so that's an important piece because it's everything from posting pictures that kids don't want out there to writing really malicious things about them online. So to me, it's about the modality that's being used to hurt or harm, but oftentimes you do see it in a category under what does bullying look like. This next one, I'll cover this fairly quickly, but I still think it's an important piece to put in here, and it's where does bullying happen? And bullying can happen, and I think I can quickly cover this first bullet. It's face-to-face, it's the whispered comments, it's the things that are written on a bathroom wall, gossip, rumors. The important piece with me, though, is that, it can happen in all these different places. It can happen face-to-face. It can happen online. It can happen out in the community. Is that so often bullying happens outside the view of adults. And I think that that's the really important piece here is kids are savvy enough now to know that they are going to probably more than likely face consequences if they're caught bullying by an adult. But what's happening is they're trying to be much more covert about their bullying these days. This next slide with the common views and myths, I want to just cover a few, and I think that they start to have a pattern, a definite pattern after a while. But I can tell you from having done this work now since early 2000 till present, I'm always struck by how much at the time when I first started the work, these were very common statements that you see up on the screen here. So the bullying is a natural part of childhood. Words will never hurt you. Some people deserve to be bullied. Bullying will make kids tougher. Telling a teacher about bullying is tattling. It's only teasing. And of course, that classic sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you. And I think about those, and those were all sort of what I would call a rationalization around bullying that we had in early 2000, just as far as a society. And bullying really somewhat was an accepted part of childhood at that time. But I would say fast forward now to 2019, And I think the majority of society has really come to understand the significant impact that bullying does have on our young people. Everything from their emotional health to their physical health is impacted. And so we do not hear these common views and myths as much anymore, but I put them in there as even more of a little bit of a historical look back for us. And aligned with that somewhat historical look too is just, why is it important that we're talking about bullying prevention? What is the impact of it? And we have broken it down into these three categories, and there certainly are a lot that fall under each category. But primary is that bullying impacts the research shows it impacts the student's education, in that there's definite school avoidance. Kids who are bullied do not want to go to school. They do not want to face the person who is doing the bullying. And I think that's probably much more common than we realize. And so if you're a normally happy kid who used to bounce out of bed every morning to get up and go to school isn't anymore, and you might want to be asking some of those bullying questions that we'll talk about later. But the second there is somewhat tied to education, and I'll explain that, because a lot of times when kids aren't getting out of bed in the morning, they might be talking about having a stomach ache or a headache, something that's not quite tangible. But it's not to say that they're definitely not experiencing those symptoms, because they might be manifesting from being bullied, and they're making themselves, they're feeling sick to their tummy about the thought of going to school or giving themselves a headache. And so it does lead to a lot of things. And for our teens and our tweens, we hear a lot more about issues such as depression and fear and anxiety. And you can imagine, if you know that you have to go to school that day and face the person who's making your life absolutely miserable, you're gonna start to have some health consequences to that. And the third, again, I feel like this somewhat overlaps with our health issues, is our safety issues, but it's the harm to self and others. And some of the things that we do hear about is kids who are being bullied, they do absolutely start to, are more prone to behaviors such as cutting and those pieces. They also have self-isolation, increased aggression. And we have also heard about those kids with suicide ideation, and those who um, do take their lives. So safety is definitely an issue to be looking at with why bullying prevention is important. Our next category then is, we want to just look at the roles involved in bullying. And one of the things, well, we'll break this down into three, and we're going to talk about these three separately, but it's the individual who's targeted by the behavior. The second role is the person's initiating the behavior, and the third is those witnessing the behavior. And if we talk about one, the student who bullies, and I think oftentimes people will ask, well, how do we know who's going to be the student who bullies? And so often we look back in our past history, and we think that's the person who's large in stature, somebody bigger. But in reality, a person who bullies is defined by his or her behavior. Someone who bullies can be any size, they can be any race, religion, gender. They can be the popular kid, and oftentimes might be, or they can be rejected by the in-groups or their social circles at school. But the typical common denominator is really that it's an individual who's seeking to have power and control over someone else. And oftentimes, there's been a few characteristics that the research will show that children who bully share, and it's oftentimes they'll have contempt or a feeling of dislike for someone else they consider to be inferior to them or undeserving of their respect. Oftentimes there's also a sense of entitlement, and also a sense of intolerance for the differences of others. Which leads us into the students who are targeted by bullying. And again, no typical profile of those who might be subjected to the bullying, but there are some common characteristics in that they might be those individuals who struggle with the ability to defend themselves, and oftentimes that might be because they don't have a social circle to look out for them. They might be socially isolated, and I think even the research shows that sometimes even having one friend, they'll be less likely to be a target of bullying because peers are so important and they're more likely to come and help another child. And kids will recognize that vulnerability of the isolated child. Some other characteristics the research has shown is that they oftentimes will avoid being noticed. And what does that mean? Sometimes they're the ones who don't want to be noticed, and the kids who are doing the bullying pick up on that, and they realize that there's some vulnerability there as well. They also might have difficulty communicating or reading the social skills. And also we know that our kids with disabilities are bullied at a much higher rate too than kids without disabilities. But in reality, bullying can happen to anyone, and I've seen it happen to the most popular of kids too. I want to mention one thing before we go on to promising practices too. Those 3 roles that I outlined earlier, it's interesting to note that I think sometimes it's tempting to pigeonhole somebody into just one of those categories, but in reality, most of our kids have been bullied, have been targeted by bullying, and have witnessed bullying at some point in their school history. So all right, so I'm keeping an eye on time here, and I see we're at 2:25, and so I know that I'm talking kind of fast and covering a lot of ground, so my apologies for that, but I do want to try to get through the majority of our slides here. And these next ones are really at the heart and soul of what us as parents or what us as educators can do. It's those promising practices that we know. And so I think one of the first things I want to talk about too is support for the youth who are doing the bullying. And this is an important piece because oftentimes it's our kids who are doing the bullying that they need that support to really help them understand what their behaviors are. And I'm going to just mention a few things here. That one of the things is to obviously to sit down and talk with the youth who's doing the bullying, and especially as a parent, because I think so often we find out when we first find out that it's our child who has the bullying behavior, as parents, we're pretty surprised. We don't always know that. And I think that's where our teachers are of such help because they see our kids in social situations that we would never see them in as parents. And so, again, just having that conversation. And during that conversation is find out the reasons for their behavior. Ask them why it is, in a non-judgmental way. Ask them what it is that they're feeling, why they feel the need to do this. And I think another important piece, and we'll talk in more detail about, is just developing an action plan. And we try not to call kids who bully, we try not to refer to them as the bully. We try to say bullying is about behavior and that behavior can be changed, but it doesn't just happen. And that's where it's really important that you develop an action plan because it's not likely that the child is going to outgrow it. And especially if there's never any consequences. If there's not consequences, they're probably going to just continue down that path. And so creating that plan is very important. You want to first determine and understand the situation, then help the child think through how their behavior can be different and what steps are you going to take to help them change that. And I think within this too, it's just as a parent or educator, making your expectations very clear and also providing those clear and consistent consequences. And we could talk a whole hour about what some of those consequences might be because I think this is such an important piece. But also remember to just provide positive feedback as the child does change and be realistic. So So again, this is a big topic, and it's something that I'm just touching briefly on, but it's important. The important takeaway is that definitely, absolutely provide consequences for the youth who bully and make them appropriate for the age and the situation. The next slide, again, this is in my mind such another important piece, but it's those students who witness bullying. And they're such an important group. And because the students who witness the bullying, we know that they're the ones who know about the bullying long before the adults do. And they understand their school culture. They know who the vulnerable students are. The other important pieces here with these kids is they usually don't like the bullying, but they aren't sure to help. And if we can give our bystanders the support and the engagement and the education that they need to take action, they're an incredibly powerful group. And so I want to just show a chart on this next slide about the power of bystanders, in that this is some important research that was done a few years back. And I'll just explain it briefly. But the researchers surveyed 14,000 students about what are helpful things that they can do for someone who's being bullied. And some of the takeaways are the 4 bullets on the right. But number 1 was spending time with a student being bullied. Number 2 was trying to get the student bullied away from the situation. Number 3 was listening to the student being bullied. Number 4, telling the student that no one deserved to be bullied. And so really what the summary is here is that kids who are being supportive of those who are being targeted by bullying, their support is incredibly meaningful. And what we tell them, it's not about jumping into the middle of a fight. It's really where you can make a difference, is about being there for that person who's being bullied. And that becomes just an incredibly important piece. And, we'd like to see that built into school curriculums around bullying, but also as parents out there, it's just so important to be sharing that message with your son or daughter that, hey, you can make a difference for someone just by saying that, going up to them and saying they didn't deserve that, and reaching out and just letting them know they're not alone and asking to involve them. So we're actually doing a lot of work on this that's going to be coming out in more campaigns and everything during 2019. And again, it's a huge topic, but I do want to just touch on it to hit the high points. This one is an important slide for our parents and our educators out there, and because I think oftentimes there's a misperception with kids that they think that adults know how often bullying happens, and vice versa. Conversely, I think adults will say, well, bullying doesn't happen at our school, or my child isn't bullying, or my child isn't being bullied. And the reason for that is that so much of it happens outside the view of adults. And one of the things that as we think about, and there's a couple of reasons for it, it happens outside the view of adults. And let me just step back here. First of all, with kids, when they're being physically bullied, it's pretty easy to see. But so much of the bullying that happens right now is about emotional bullying. And so a casual observer is not going to necessarily recognize things like intimidation or manipulation or gossip or rumors. Or even sometimes if we see it happening, because as adults, we don't have the full knowledge or access to those nuances, the context of a situation or the social structure behind the behavior, the inside jokes that kids have, they could be tormenting someone, and we may not even necessarily know it without having that kind of inside knowledge. But at the same time, that behavior is definitely impacting the student's psyche and their self-esteem, because they have this emotional upheaval of what's happening to them, but nobody's necessarily recognizing it as bullying. And that second bullet, bullying happens outside the view of adults. And if you think about it, there's it's not happening in a classroom in front of a teacher. It's happening in a locker room or in a cafeteria or out in the resource, happening during recess in the far corners. But also it's happening online. It's kids are hanging out in places online that we don't have access to, such as group chats or gaming or social media sites that are specifically designed for teens. And so I think that's just an important piece. And the third one is our kids just simply don't tell us that they're being bullied, and they don't notify their parents or their teachers. And there's a number of reasons for that lack of reporting. And so it's just an important things to be thinking about. And, because sometimes you think, oh, my child isn't being bullied or this child isn't susceptible to bullying, but they're may not necessarily be the case. And again, as I'm keeping an eye on time here, we're at 2:35. And so there's a number of reasons that students don't tell, and I don't think we'll go into that because we do have a page on our website, but just it's oftentimes hard for kids to come and talk to their parents or to tell a teacher. And that list of reasons up on the screen, everything from they may be judged, they may feel embarrassed, they may feel responsible, they may think it doesn't do any good. But the important thing that we're really trying to get the message out to is to make sure that students are talking to an adult. And I want to just share these conversation starters as a way to help your child talk. And I think these are probably appropriate for we need to, it's not only for our younger kids, but also for our older kids, because bullying can happen anywhere on the whole continuum of our school, of our child's journey through school. And so just ask open-ended questions that help you get at the behavior that might be happening. Something like, how was gym class today? If you know that sometimes they may struggle with athletics, or who'd you sit by at lunch? That's always a big one. Or this one, and I talked a lot about when kids say they want to stay home, one conversation might be, you seem to be feeling sick a lot and want to stay home. Please tell me about that. You can even ask some of these direct questions. Are kids making fun of you? Or are there a lot of cliques at school? What do you think about those cliques? And so sometimes you can ask that direct question about bullying, but oftentimes these conversations might be easier ways to just initiate it and then to get deeper. And then when your kids do tell you, these are just some tips to make sure that you tell them it's not their fault, they're not to blame. Make sure you emphasize they are not alone, that you are here to help. I think kids who are bullied start to feel so incredibly alone and like nothing is ever going to change. And let them know it's not up to them to stop the bullying, though we do want them to have a voice in that, and that bullying is never okay. They have the right to be safe. They have the right to be treated with respect and to feel safe at school. And then conversely, I just want to touch on a couple of reactions to avoid. And one would be encouraging them to stand up to the person bullying. If you think as an adult how intimidating it can be to stand up to somebody, say at your workplace or at a social function, who is acting inappropriately, and translate that to how your child might be feeling, it's incredibly intimidating. The second one would be to tell them to ignore the bullying. We want to avoid that. If kids are coming to us and sharing that they're being bullied, it's really important that we honor that and that we start to talk through a plan for them and how to address it. Also, that third one is taking matters into your own hands. So often we hear about parents who say they want to call up the parents of the child who's doing the bullying, and we find that has often been very counterproductive, as tempting as it is to do. So to be talking to your child's school is a stronger strategy to take in that situation. All right, I'm going to pause there just for a second. This is similar with addressing cyberbullying, starting the conversation, and that it's important to note that just as you set up rules in your child's physical world, do the same in their cyber world too. And before your child ever gets that first cell phone, I would highly encourage you to start having the cyber conversation, and we have lots of tips on how to do this on our website as well at pacer.org/bullying. And we talked a little bit about helping students plan, and I think that this is just an important piece that we have on our website, and it's called a student action plan, and hopefully Angela could send out a link to that later. But it's a document designed to either have a student go through it on their own, or B, go through it as a parent with them. And so it's simple 3 steps. You first they think about the bullying the bullying situation, then they think how that situation could be different, and then think about those steps needed to make it happen. Again, bullying doesn't just stop without bullying typically doesn't stop without some sort of intervention, so just incredibly important piece. And then we also encourage all adults, especially parents, to have your own action plan. When you hear that your child's being bullied, it's important to be thinking this through the steps that you're going to take as well. And so it can be everything about deciding who you want to involve, like who are you going to be contacting about this? At the school, are you going to look outside the school to health professionals or law enforcement? Know what your rights are, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. And also for those students, parents who have a student with a disability, just how do you leverage your IEP or your 504? And also during this process, be keeping records. And with cyberbullying, again, what I'm going to focus on with this slide is just the importance of, I think the uniqueness of cyberbullying is that so much of bullying is hard to quantify or necessarily capture. And the interesting thing about cyberbullying is that there is an actual electronic trail that gets created, whether it's by text, whether it's by social media. There's something tangible there that is being said or posted about your child. I would highly encourage you, as part of the record keeping process, to be taking screenshots, to be saving the text. As horrible as they are, you can delete them after you get those screenshots. But they're important elements to share when you are reporting bullying, either to a school or to, your healthcare provider or other individuals. All right, and this slide, the focal point of it is that at stopbullying.gov, there is an interactive map on there in which you can click on. Throughout every state, and it has direct links back to the individual state laws. So again, that URL is stopbullying.gov, very helpful URL. And Angela, maybe you can be sure to post that afterwards too, so that individuals can link back directly to find any state law or policy that addresses bullying. And those laws usually will provide everything from the definition to what your rights are. And anytime that your child is involved at a bullying situation in school, typically there is going to be a school policy. And so you want to be finding that school policy, and it's generally posted on websites, but oftentimes they'll also be put in the student manuals too. So it's just a great place to be looking for, what is the protocol? How do I report a bullying situation to the school? What sort of documentation should I be providing? And so that is part of your kind of parent plan. You should be looking into your school policy as well. And again, I realize I'm going quick on a lot of these slides, so I'm going to run over to about to 10 before the hour to wrap up here, to give myself a little bit extra time. But as a follow-up to that record keeping, and again, I'm hoping Angela will post a link to this, we do offer a template letter that's available as a Word document or PDF that can be easily downloaded, and then it's sort of a fill in the blank. And what's the nice thing about this letter is that it just clearly states what has happened, and and about contacting the school. So a useful tool for parents and for schools as well. This next one on working with children with disabilities, I do want to share that on our pacer.org/bullying, we have a complete mini module. There's about 10 different tabs on it. It's probably the size of, of a website onto itself. And that handsome guy to the left there is my son David, and that's his friend Josh to the right. But that module contains information about working with children with when a child with a disability is being bullied. And what I do want to point out is while there's not a federal law about bullying, there is a federal law about harassment. And I said this a little bit earlier, but the distinction between bullying and harassment is really when the bullying is based on the student's disability. So say, for example, if my son David was being called a disparaging word over and over again and being teased and made fun of because of that word, that would be bullying based on his disability. And at that point, it does reach the threshold of disability harassment, and it needs to be treated a little differently. And on this slide are listed those federal policies which outline that. And so it's the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and Title II of the American with Disabilities Act, and also just our IDEA. And so again, if you have a particular situation about a child with a disability, you can absolutely email me about that, and Angela will provide my email as well, because so often the dynamics of our kids with disabilities being bullied are much more complicated, but the thing is they oftentimes have more rights and more opportunities to address it. And one of those things is what I want to point out here is sitting down with your 504 IEP team, and PACER offers a handout with ideas on how to do this, as far as just what are some of the things that you might want to include in the 504 IEP if your child's being bullied. Everything from identifying an adult in the school who the child can report to, determining how school staff will document and report incidents. Could also, for example, allow the child to leave class early to avoid hallway incidents. And this fourth one, which I love, educating peers about school district policies on bullying behavior and how they can be supportive of the student with a disability. And so the important thing here is we have a module outlining a lot of the specifics about a student with disability and their rights and what you can do, but also you can feel free to email me with questions that you have about your student with a disability. I'm going to have to skip over the peer advocacy project, but that's outlined within that module as well. But it's really about how do we connect our non-disabled peers to be supportive of our students with disabilities. And so there's a great video on that site along with a booklet about how to engage. And that one is too, if you're more interested in learning about the parameters and the kind of the process of developing a peer advocacy project, I'm happy to provide more in-depth information on that. So I'm just going to close out with a few resources. And the first one, on our website at pacer.org, in the upper navigation, there's a module called What Parents Should Know About Bullying. And then if you look toward the bottom of the slide, you can see there's 5 areas, everything from definition to the laws and policies, to how do you help your child, to working with the school, to mobile and online safety. And again, we have several little microsites even within our website, and this is one of them. It's an incredibly robust piece there that you can just walk through almost step by step to get some ideas on next steps. And some of the documents that I talked about, such as the student action plan and the template letter, and those pieces are all linked right into that file as well. And then for any of our educators who are out there, pacer.org/bullying, on that upper navigation, that blue bar that you can see on the screenshot there, there's a hub labeled Classroom. And within that hub, we have broke down to 4 categories. There's an elementary school curriculum, there's day-long, week-long, and year-long opportunities in there that leverage all the resources that we have developed, as well as a lot of activities that are designed both for elementary school and for middle and high school. And you can see we broke down the resources kind of like by the elementary school, and then we brought middle and high school together into one category. But then there's the curriculum, and then there's activities, with activities really being more kind of a one-off, one-time opportunity, chances to do things. One of the things I do want to highlight, though, especially for our educators out there, is we do have a year-long classroom resource. And so you can see at this tab that has September, October, November, December, all the way through April, that it's set up so that during September, there's 4 weeks of activities, or education activities, and pieces on there that you can do. And then each month, so there's I think 36 weeks of lesson plans. So everything from PowerPoints to classroom interaction to activities to books and videos. And so it's a comprehensive resource that I would really encourage. And I would mention again, all our resources, and 98% of our resources are free to download at no cost. All In does have a sign-in process, but other than that, it is free for anyone to use. And I'm going to close out with a new resource that we developed. And so this is that 2% that we do charge for, because it is print materials. And so we have an event kit, which has wonderful print resources for up to 50 participants. We do sell this for $50, but includes everything from 5 large posters to these cards that we call intentional acts of kindness, acceptance, inclusion cards, to brochures, to bookmarks, to decals, pencils. And so you're really, if you order it, you're receiving a lot for your $50. And we've seen everything from people using this at events to just having it in the classroom, or PTAs have used it. And so as you can see, it's a very visual, colorful piece, and what it offers is both education, inspiration, and awareness. And so it's a very nice piece. It's been very, very well received. They've been kind of flying off our shelves. You can find those on the shop down at the bottom of pacer.org. There's a tab called Shop that they're available at. So, Angela, I realize I went a little bit over my time, but that's the end of our slides, and that I went through things quickly. But most of the information that I've provided during this is also available at pacer.org/bullying. And I know that we want to save a few moments at the end for questions. So.
Great, thank you so much, Julie. We're now going to begin answering the questions submitted through to this afternoon's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit your questions through the question pane on your control panel. If you're unable to get to everyone's questions, or if someone has an additional question they would like to ask outside of this platform, here at the Tourette Association, we have a full-time information and referral staff who can answer your questions. Feel free to also email us at support@tourette.org or call 1-888-4-Tourette. So Julie, someone asked a question. It's multi-parted. So I'm going to just read you the different questions and we can answer them as we go, okay?
Sure, sounds good.
So the first one, how can a young adult who was bullied in a school environment where the bullying/harassment was denied and tolerated process and heal from past bullying?
It's a good question, and it's more, I think we're talking a little bit more about a therapeutic process, and so it sounds like this individual has graduated, and it's not something that I would typically respond to, but from just as a kind of an instinctive response, and maybe not a research-based response, would be that I think it's just so important to talk about it. And the thing that we find when individuals who have been away from school for a while is how emotionally painful the experience is. And I know for a lot of young people, the way that what has been therapeutic or helpful or healing for them is to, number one, to express it in a way that makes sense for them. So for some kids, it's about writing. For some kids, it's about making a video. And, in some ways, it's like releasing the story from you, because I think what happens so often is we hold on to that hurt and we focus on that hurt. And so oftentimes people think if I don't talk about it, it's not going to hurt anymore. But again, this is just anecdotally, we find that the more people talk about it, the not that the pain ever goes away, but I think that it becomes easier to handle on a daily basis.
Great. So the second part of the question, are there resources available besides individual counseling?
Besides individual counseling in a situation like that, again, it's not my area of expertise. So I almost feel like we should maybe, Angela, see if we can follow up with some resources for that. But I know that there are things available for adults who have gone through, and I don't want to use the word trauma, but I can't think of anything else. But that there's group therapy for those situations, and also oftentimes we find that people who volunteer maybe for other kids or help other kids who have gone through similar circumstances sometimes find healing in that too. But Angela, I feel like maybe we should research that one and find out a little bit more information.
Sure, of course. And the person who asked this question, please feel free to reach out to us directly. You can reach out to me or the webinar, and we can always follow up. And Julie, you and I can talk offline too.
Sure.
So there is another part of this question also. So what if the bullied also bullies? An example, a child with motor tics and OCD has been bullied for many years and who now is doing some bullying due to OCD/sensory processing issues, intolerance of other students with disabilities who have hygiene issues, sensory and visual.
And thank you to the person who asked this question, because it's a lot more common than you think. We hear so much from kids who bully because they were bullied. And I think people always be like, well, they should know how it felt. And it's not, it's just never that simple. And so the best thing that you can be doing in that situation is to be, again, talking with a child and getting at the root of of the behavior and really involving them in the solution. Because I think so often we want to jump, as adults, we want to jump to what is the answer and to make assumptions based on, say, our own experiences. But it's so important, and whether the child's being bullied, whether they're doing the bullying, that we involve them in the solution. And what I mean by that is asking them, if you could even use that three-step plan of what is the scenario, think through how you would like this situation to be different. So have them visualize how it's going to be different. And then third, let them have a voice in how that's going to happen. And it's not to say that they have to do it on their own, but it's really critical that they have input into the solution, because then it's more likely to be effective.
Great, thank you. And we have one last part of this question. What would you recommend in a situation where the adult or professional is the one who's harassing due to the lack of awareness of the disability of the child?
Another great question. I think so often when we talk about bullying, it's about power dynamics. And I'll mention too, in most state laws, it's written peer-to-peer. There's a few that do within the state laws include that dynamic of adult to child too. So say, for example, an educator or someone in the schools doing the bullying. So number one, I'd be looking at your state laws to find that piece out, because there might be you might have different rights in different scenarios. But with a very dynamic of bullying being somebody has more power and control over the other one, and I think that's always true when it's an adult doing this to a child. So I would encourage kids to never be confrontive or combative with the adult who's doing it, but it becomes then even more so to be reporting it to a trusted adult, and whether that trusted adult is your parent or another educator. But it's not something that a child is going to be able to resolve on their own. And so it becomes more about making sure that as a parent, that you're documenting what's happening, that you have a clear role, and that if that child is coming to you, that you're getting all the facts straight, and then you're looking to, like, how do you go up that chain of command then to report this and make sure that steps are taken so that that person is made aware that their behavior is going on, that it's impacting that child, and then figuring out what's going to be done next. And again, some of that is even within Department of Education. There's oftentimes rules too. So that one, if somebody has a specific situation, they can absolutely contact us too.
Great, thank you, Julie. So that's all the direct questions that we had. The only other question is whether the slides will be archived for later viewing. So yes, the webinar was recorded, and you should all be receiving an email up to 24 hours after this afternoon's webinar with the link to view. If not, then it will absolutely be posted to our Tourette Association YouTube channel within the next few weeks. So you absolutely will be able to view this again. So thank you again so much, Julie. This is all the time that we have for the webinar. Once the webinar is closed, you will also receive a survey on the presentation, and we would greatly appreciate if you could complete that and provide your feedback. You'll also receive a follow-up email within the 24 to 48 hours to view the recording again if you had specific questions on specific slides. I know Julie mentioned there are some links in there for everyone to check out. So that is where you will find those. Additionally, the webinar, as I mentioned, will be posted to the Tourette Association YouTube channel for those who were unable to participate today. We encourage you all to reach out to us on social media about this webinar or for other ideas and suggestions you may have for future webinars. On behalf of the Tourette Association, thank you again for joining us and taking the time to view our presentation. And for all of those interested in Julie's email, it is julie.hertzog@pacer.org. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.